The European Union, along with its closely integrated neighbours, is an economic titan. Collectively, it's the second largest economy in the world, trailing only the United States. Germany, on its own, has surpassed a stagnant Japan to become the world's third largest economic power. The continent is a mosaic of high-income, advanced economies celebrated for their exceptional living standards. But behind the veneer of prosperity, a deep-seated anxiety is taking hold. Economists are worried, very worried, about Europe's future. For nearly 2 decades, the continent has been caught in a cycle of relative stagnation, falling further and further behind the raw economic output of the USA. Now, to be fair, the American economy has been a powerhouse, outpacing almost everyone, including rapidly developing nations like China. So, it might be tempting to say Europe hasn't fallen behind so much as the US has rocketed ahead. But that just begs the question, why? Why has a continent with more people, competitive salaries, world-class education, and a stable business environment failed to keep pace? The bad news is that many of Europe's current economic problems are self-inflicted. The good news? What is self-inflicted can also be self-healed. The slowdown isn't due to one single issue, but a convergence of critical challenges in 4 key areas: industry, energy, innovation, and immigration. Let's break down how these interconnected problems created a perfect storm that, by 2025, has left Europe's economy in a precarious position. There's an almost perfect correlation between energy use and economic wealth. Rich countries power their large homes, cars, and modern comforts with immense amounts of energy, and energy-intensive industries generate immense wealth. For decades, Europe, and especially its manufacturing heartland Germany, had a secret weapon: cheap and abundant natural gas piped in from Russia. This fuel powered the continent's heavy industries, from chemical plants to car factories, making them globally competitive. But that era is definitively over. The geopolitical rupture of the early 2020s severed this energy lifeline, exposing a critical vulnerability. This external shock was then compounded by a series of internal decisions. Most notably, Germany, Europe's de facto industrial hub, pressed ahead with decommissioning its nuclear power plants, shutting down a reliable, carbon-free source of baseline power right when it was needed most. The result has been a persistent energy price crisis. While prices have cooled from their 2022 peaks, they remain structurally high, crippling the competitiveness of European industry. Look no further than Volkswagen, a cornerstone of the German economy. For the first time in its 87-year history, the company announced plans to shut down production sites in its home market, battered by high costs and fierce competition from US and Chinese electric vehicle makers. While a last-minute deal with unions in late 2024 prevented the outright closure of factories, it came at the cost of tens of thousands of socially responsible job cuts and significant reductions in production. This isn't an isolated case. It's part of a larger trend. Why build in Europe with its expensive energy, high wages, and tight regulations? Iconic European brands are increasingly moving production abroad. The largest BMW factory in the world isn't in Bavaria, it's in South Carolina, USA. This is great for BMW's investors and Germany's GDP figures, but it offers little comfort to the German factory worker whose job could have been done at home. Europe is now in a race to transition to renewables. In 2024, solar and wind power grew to generate nearly half of the EU's electricity, with solar overtaking coal for the first time. But this transition is a double-edged sword. In the short term, it's a massive expense that doesn't solve the immediate competitiveness problem. And in a bitter twist of irony, it risks swapping one dependency for another. The solar panels that will power Europe's future are overwhelmingly produced in China, highlighting the continent's next major vulnerability: the innovation gap. If you can't compete on the cost of energy and labor, you must compete on technology. Innovation is the lifeblood of a modern economy. It's how you create more value, justify higher wages, and define the future. Europe was the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. Yet today, it has fallen decidedly behind in the global innovation race. With a few towering exceptions, like the Dutch company ASML, which makes the indispensable machines that create advanced semiconductors, it's difficult to name a European company at the absolute cutting-edge technology. The EU is being outpaced by both the US and China. In 2022, the US invested more than double what Europe did in deep tech. This gap is driven by structural factors. The EU simply has far fewer large, innovative companies in key high-tech sectors. So, what happened? First, is the flywheel effect. The US has created a self-reinforcing ecosystem where top universities, massive venture capital funds, and giant tech companies all feed off one another. If you have a brilliant idea in Europe, the funding, talent, and exit opportunities are often better across the Atlantic. This leads directly to the second problem, a catastrophic brain drain. Europe is losing its most educated and productive people, who are leaving for more lucrative opportunities in the tech and finance sectors of the US, and, since Brexit, London. Third, there is the EU's famously strict regulatory environment. The Brussels effect has given consumers worldwide better products, like the universal USB-C charger. But, for a new startup, navigating local laws plus an additional layer of EU-wide regulation is a significant burden that doesn't exist to the same degree in the US. This has even fostered a culture of copycat. Companies in Europe which clone successful American platforms for local markets with the primary goal of being acquired by the very companies they copied, a strategy that enriches a few entrepreneurs but does little to foster genuine, world-beating innovation. An economy can ultimately only grow in a few ways: get more workers, make existing workers more productive, or have them work longer hours. We've seen the challenges with productivity. So, what about the workforce itself? The demographic reality is stark. Not a single country in the EU has a birth rate high enough to sustain its population. Growth, therefore, depends entirely on immigration. Immigration can be a powerful economic engine. But Europe's approach has been different from other advanced economies like Canada or Australia. A large portion of migration into the EU is based on family reunification and asylum. While these are vital for social and humanitarian reasons, they are not as immediately economically stimulating as programs focused on attracting high-skilled workers to fill specific labor gaps. This leads to a toxic and polarized public debate. Any discussion about controlling immigration is often labeled as racist, while those on the other side use it as a scapegoat for all economic ills. This prevents a balanced, pragmatic conversation about creating an immigration system that meets both humanitarian obligations and economic needs. The conversation also misses a crucial point. It's not just about who is coming in, but who is leaving. The ongoing brain drain means Europe is losing its most technically skilled and ambitious workers to the US. Looking at the numbers, the euro area's labour force participation is actually higher than in the workaholic USA. But this statistic is deeply misleading. Unemployment in many EU countries remains higher. Europeans, on average, work far fewer hours. And the upward trend in participation isn't driven by a dynamic economy, but by older people being forced to work longer just to make ends meet, a sign of economic strain, not strength. So, Europe is in a tough spot. Its energy is expensive, its industries are moving, and it's losing the innovation race. But here's the most important question of all. Does lagging behind the US on headline GDP figures actually matter? The answer depends on what you value. Big tech companies might boost economic figures, but their wealth is often concentrated among a small number of investors and employees. The output of a social media giant, while financially valuable, probably isn't as fundamental to human well-being as the high-quality manufacturing and traditional industries that Europe still excels at. The average person in the US might be more productive on paper, but after accounting for things like universal healthcare, affordable education, and generous vacation time, the average person in many European countries is arguably living a better, less stressful life. America is richer, but much of Europe might be happier. But this is no reason for complacency. Prolonged economic stagnation is a corrosive force. It threatens to make Europe's cherished social model, with its robust safety nets and public services, completely unaffordable. It worsens youth unemployment, stifles social mobility, and accelerates the brain drain, creating a vicious cycle that is hard to break. The economic sabotage of 2025 wasn't the result of one single event, but a series of choices. Decisions on energy policy that created vulnerability, a regulatory culture that, while well-intentioned, can stifle the continent's innovative spirit, and a collective failure to create enough opportunities to convince its brightest minds to build their future at home. These problems were self-inflicted, and that means With political will and a clear-eyed view of the challenges, they can be fixed. The question is whether Europe's leaders are ready to make the difficult choices required to do so.